That typing you hear is not an illusion. It is Mike Niziolek live on Mind Your Banners. I'm not sure what he's typing. I really don't know. I'm Zach Osterman. He's Mike Niziolek. This is Mind Your Banners for April 22nd, 2025. We are firmly pointed toward the off season, but that doesn't mean that there are things to talk about. There isn't work to do. Mike, are you writing a very exciting Little 500 preview at this moment in time? Is that
I will have a preview. We could preview. I thought we'd get your Little 500 take at the end.
I keep it to myself. I'm coaching a team. It's you're just focused on the next day. It's just you just take it. You take it one workout at a time. Every workout 6 seconds of workout. Every workout has a mind of its own or a life.
How much is a lap? Wouldn't it be a lap in this case? Every lap of its own.
Every lap. So about 39 seconds a lap. Every lap. But in Little 5, every lap really does have a life of its own. If you don't believe me, go find the 2005 Little 500 when a team hit the brakes and lap 1, turn 1, and half the field wrecked out. He is Mike Niziolek, and yes, there will be a Little 500 preview at HeraldTimesOnline.com at some point this week. I will be behind the fence for Five-Side this weekend, so I'll keep most of my thoughts to myself. But you came here to talk or to hear us talk and join us in talking about IU sports. We're going to focus primarily on basketball today, sort of recap a lot of the roster building work that has been done in the last, basically month or so for Darian DeVries. But before we did that, I did want to get Mike's thoughts on the spring game. He was at IU football spring game Thursday night. I was not. The offense won narrowly, if I'm not mistaken, Mike. This was not televised anywhere. So there are no highlights. There's nothing to look back on, which means that having Mike's insight is worth its weight in gold. I know you've written some different pieces on maybe players that stood out, positions that stood out, kind of storylines from the evening. But as you've had some time to digest it, what are maybe some of the biggest takeaways from that spring game that really left, sort of stuck with you?
Yeah, I mean, not a whole ton. I mean, they even though it's not televised, they still didn't, open up the offense and do anything crazy. These games are very sort of vanilla, so you see a lot of checkdowns and things. There were only a handful of shots, downfield, passing opportunities, vertical passing opportunities. In terms of storylines, I thought, now that behind closed doors, what we've seen sort of at practice was that, Fernando Mendoza was the number 1 quarterback. Alberto was number 2, and that was the case in the spring game. Like, there's no sort of subterfuge or anything. Like, Grant Wilson's sort of probably the third guy, emergency guy. Only got, I think, 5 snaps in the spring game, but Alberto will back up his brother, which I thought, is an interesting sort of mix there with a guy, very young, and the backup had to come in last year for Indiana. So I think, you're always looking at backup quarterback as sort of an unheralded position, but an important one, because it's hard to make it through a season, without getting dinged up at that spot. In terms of the, players that stood out, Elijah Hardy, I think we talked about last week, kind of previewing the game and being a name to watch, returned a pick 6. Was on a tipped pass, but still made a heads-up play, really athletic, kind of breaking to the ball, and then bowled over a couple of guys to get to the end zone. Kurt Cignetti spoke about him highly after the game. Aiden Fisher continues to speak about him highly. And I think when you talk about, one of the guys that's, was going to be the hardest to replace, but now might be one of the easiest because they have the talent lined up in terms of Jalen Walker, Hardy seems to be, a sort of seamless transition there. As far as everything else, they held out some starters, some key guys. Mikel Kamara, Aiden Fisher, were both dressed out but didn't play. Elijah Surratt was not dressed out. He was held out, which I think you kind of thought that might happen in terms of just, protecting guys that had been in the system for a very long time. There's no need for them to get a ton of reps. So they missed the spring game. And then Mekhi Jackson sat out, the App State transfer receiver. So, I mean, when you talk about kind of portal needs, what I wrote is that the talent, I don't think there's any question that they have a talented top line group of 4 to 5 receivers. But they're short on numbers, and you saw in the spring game like what that could lead to if you're down 2 guys for a game or even a guy for a game, where you're going to have to start pulling walk-ons or or moving his tight end to slot. I mean, I know Holden Stace had a nice early catch, and he's certainly capable of that. But numbers-wise, you're coming out of the spring game. That's sort of, I think, where you look. Just because Jackson, I think, is limited with a hamstring injury basically throughout camp. Obviously holding out to protect him, no reason to sort of test it. But numbers-wise at receiver, I think when you're coming out of spring, those are some of the things that sort of stood out from the spring games and the spring camp as we kind of go forward.
Because you need, I mean, like when we talk about injuries, it's not just about the player you're missing. It's also that if you don't have adequate depth and injuries start to hit, that often puts your healthy players at greater risk for injury because you're asking them to play more. And, when you see sort of a quote unquote injury crisis, there's a lot of times where it almost is centered in one or two positions. And the reason why is because maybe you lack a little bit of depth to begin with. You lose somebody, you try to stretch everybody else a little bit thinner to cover the gaps that open up. Then somebody else gets injured, maybe because you've stretched them a little bit thin. And they've worn their body down a little bit more. Now they're more susceptible to injury. Suddenly you got to spread everybody out a little bit further. And then it just kind of cascades down the roster. We've seen that a couple of times. I saw it with an Indiana team a few years ago at wide receiver, had some really good pieces at the top line, lost one or two of them, and suddenly found itself relying on freshmen who just flatly were not ready.
If you looked at last year, they were able to handle an injury to Curtis Rourke with Taven Jackson for a game. It was only a game, but it's still, I mean, you don't win that game, you don't get the playoff. And then on the offensive line, Taylor Stevens coming in, and I know they struggled a little bit late, without Drew Evans, but still having a guy with starting experience that was functional, that could operate, that didn't have to you don't have to scale back the offense, was really important for Indiana. And I think it'll be just important. I think the offensive line is sneaky. The depth of the offensive line is pretty sneaky this year. I mean, they've got a lot of starters. They had 2 guys out for spring camp, Khalil Benson and Evans, and brought along some young guys in their place. And so I think they're going to be like 7 deep there. And so that's a position where you kind of feel good about. But receivers sort of the opposite end of the spectrum.
Somebody asked here, well, first of all, Zach Brannigan asked, what's your favorite Nintendo game from the original NES?
Well, I mean, that's got to be Zelda. I mean, that's...
Yeah, I think that's fair. And then Anthony Leal is the GOAT, said Mendoza does have 2 years left. Yes. Fernando Mendoza has 2 years left. Now, this is his 4th year of college, so he's draft eligible after this year. I know there are people who think that, especially given Curt Cignetti's recent history with transfer quarterbacks, that he might have an NFL, if this season goes well, he might have some NFL questions to answer next spring, but he does have 2 years left if he wants them both. Indiana takes I thought, an interesting commitment in Stephen Daly. You wrote about him. The Kent State transfer played a ton of snaps. I'm looking at this, 63 quarterback pressures across, I think, the last 2 seasons, according to Pro Football Focus. Not an incredibly prolific edge player, but you kind of like what we sort of talked about when we talked about transfer needs before the spring game. We said you've got Kamara on one side, you've got some promising looking young players coming along behind him, Alandino and Ndukwe, but you feel like you need, just like some experience balance at the other side of the line. Daly feels like that. I think you point out, the need for more receiver depth is maybe even only intensified when you see it on the field in the spring game. I also thought it was interesting just reading your tweets, and this was kind of other than Alberto Mendoza being the number 2 and Grant Wilson being the number 3, and maybe that changes by fall camp, we'll find out. The other thing that from your tweets and your post-game sort of coverage that I digested really stuck with me was it was interesting to me that it seemed like in your eyes, some of the young DBs had good moments. Byron Baldwin, I know, got a mention in your dispatches. I think Jaja Boyd did too. He was a freshman last year who redshirted. I want to say he was James Madison's highest rated commitment when they all came over from JMU to IU in 2020 in the 24 class. We've talked about that secondary too. That's probably a spot, especially at safety, where Indiana could stand, not necessarily for one of those guys to be a big impact, sort of immediate impact player, but for depth. And if one or two of those young guys kind of emerges as a reliable, sort of every third or every fourth or every fifth play kind of player, it makes that group make a lot more sense.
Yeah, and Pons was on a little bit of a limited snap. He didn't play a ton. Another guy
That's another one where it just feels like you're probably just protecting him.
Didn't need to, and Knighton was out, the NIU transfer, so that opened up some opportunities for those younger guys. I think with Baldwin, you see the athleticism, and you see why. I mean, look, a lot of teams will go away from a commit once they've flipped to another school. Indiana has done that. I think Kurt Signay doesn't like guys that just sort of, want to leave or have eyes elsewhere, but they stuck with Baldwin and got him to commit back after flipping to Colorado. And I think you kind of see why. I think they think he's a guy that, ready for some work right away. We talked about there only being, 3 freshmen that didn't redshirt last year. If you're talking about a list of guys that would be, high on list for next year, not to have to redshirt or, sit out kind of and develop, Baldwin's probably at the top of the list just because of his physical traits. With the second team defense, I think most of the spring, and you kind of see why the coaching staff, A, really made it a priority to keep him, and B, really like him, just because it's just, he's got those traits that you like in that secondary. And like you said, they brought in a lot of depth in the secondary, 4 guys with double-digit starts under their belt, between safety and corner. But I think there's always room. That's a spot where you're rotating a lot of guys. You can use them in nickel packages because they do use kind of the what is it? I think Rover for them. So it's interesting. Just how much rotation you have there, and you can never have enough depth in the secondary.
There's some more. I mean, there's actually rumors of at least a couple transfer commitments that might break either today or at some point this week. So, I mean, Indiana's roster is going to keep evolving. I think they've got 5 or 6 spots still available, given maybe even a couple more than that. Now that you've got a few more outgoings, you talked about, I think it's something you wrote. You talked about there being a pretty present need for more depth along defensive line, even with Daly. I thought one name that was interesting was Kellen Wyatt, who is a linebacker at Maryland. But if you look at his profile, I think over the last 2 years, he had something like 15 tackles for loss, a little bit of a bigger linebacker. You wonder if maybe he couldn't be not a lot like Linnell Carr was converted into a bit more of kind of a tweener role. Carr kind of came at it from the other direction, but you understand what I'm saying. That being said, we'll put football to one side for kind of the rest of this show. And someone here is saying that Indiana just landed Kellen Wyatt's commitment, so that's I guess that's well timed. We'll talk about that as and when it kind of comes through. I think I'm looking at it now. It looks like Rivals is reporting that he committed. Rivals is saying over the last 2 seasons, 64 tackles, 14 TFLs, 7.5 sacks, and 2 forced fumbles. So again, probably not a player that you're thinking, starts right away, or at least is the linchpin to this defense, but adds more production, more experience, and obviously at a Big Ten level as well. As we talk about transfers, let's move over to the basketball side. Darian DeVries has, by my count now, 8 players in the fold for next season. That goes to 9 if you count Luke Goody, who's still, last I checked, is still in the sort of waiver process. I don't think there's, he's applied for that waiver. The way this works, I guess, just very quickly for people who may be unaware, is that waiver will go, I believe, my understanding is first to the Big Ten. I think the expectation is the Big Ten will deny it / basically just procedurally punt it onto the NCAA, and then it will be the NCAA that Goody really appeals for the 5th year. And if he doesn't get it, that's when he would, if he so desired, have to take it up another level to some sort of legal.
But it all could be moot if they allow the 5th year.
Yeah, I mean, that's so just kind of out
nebulous.
There.
Yeah, I know. It's all.
Yeah,
it's
you have all these. That's when you have all these players with no eligibility left going into the portal, because the NCAA has talked about just saying we're going to go to a blanket 5 years, no 5 years to play 4, They're going to get rid of, I think, a lot of the red shirt and waiver considerations, and they're just going to say you get 5 years of college athletics, you play as much as you play, and then you're done. And if they do add that 5th year, that's why you see, like someone pointed out, Peyton Sparks going in the portal yesterday. He does not have, under the current rules, any eligibility left. But if they add the 5th year, that just gives someone like him or Ian Schiffling at
Goody would fall into that, right? I mean,
Simpson. Yes, Goody would immediately, like his waiver claim would essentially be voided at that point because he would just get the 5th year. As things stand, Indiana has 8/9 players on scholarship for next season. If we include Goody, it's 9. If we include Goody, 6 of those 9 only have 1 year left. So, and in, I think, I want to say 4 of those 6 cases, even if they got the 5th year, I think they would still only have 1 year left because we're talking about players with red shirts and different things like that. It is a roster that has clearly addressed some pressing needs. I mean, beyond just quite literally needing bodies. It's a roster that's got a lot of guard depth, a lot of, sort of scoring production on its resume, a fair bit of creativity. Now I think it's a roster that needs size, and it probably needs a little bit of youth and class balance so that you're not just having to go replace 75% of your roster again this time next year. But what are your kind of early takeaways on the work that Darian DeVries and his staff have done?
Well, certainly, I mean, I think that's at the top, right? Like that you expect that this will be a complete rebuild almost next year. I mean, you got Miles, Drake, and Sicily are the only ones with eligibility left. And anybody you bring in now, outside of maybe, like you said, Frontcourt, are going to be guys on the bench. And if they're guys that are transferring in, that not just like members of the 2025 class, it's just really hard to retain your 9th through 13th player in this era of the transfer portal. So, I mean, you say bring in a couple guys with eligibility left, but I mean, even then, I don't know how much you can count on them looking forward. So, I mean, I just think it's clear that he's sort of okay with and fine with, like, if we got to do this from the ground up next year, that's fine. I mean, it just feels like that's what this is going to be, right? I mean, maybe you have 3 players instead of 1, but it's still going to be a lot of work, and you're probably going to have obviously more freshmen kind of take up those slots. But it still feels like not just a 1 year sort of dalliance in the transfer portal for him. Would you? I mean,
yeah, no. What I was going to ask, and I mean, there's no right or wrong answer to this. We don't know yet. Do you think the money changes that? Like, because I do think, especially with revenue sharing now, and kind of the idea that it's not this NIL. That number is always a little bit opaque, and nobody ever wants to say this is exactly how much we have. But when everyone knows how much money there is in revenue sharing, and broadly speaking, how much each school is committing to it does occur to me you can probably sell a pathway for a player that says we'll pay you this year, and then we'll promise to pay you this much next year, because and your pathway is essentially like if you're Josiah Miles, for example. There's every chance Miles starts for this team, but there's also every chance he's one of its first players off the bench. But it's very easy to sell him a pathway that says you're going to play a bunch of minutes, whether it's starting or on the bench or from the bench for Indiana next winter. And then, by the way, there's 6 guys in front of you that are all going to leave. And if you stay and you let us develop you and all works out according to plan, you're just going to step into those minutes, and we promise you'll step into those dollars too. I don't think it changes it for everyone. I just wonder if there aren't, especially programs like Indiana that are going to have probably one of the highest overall sort of resource pools in the sport, if you aren't going to be able to get a few more of those kids to kind of stick with it in the long term, compared to where it's been, because so much of what the portal's about right now is you go in the portal because that's how you test your value. You go in the portal.
Right, but I mean, a couple things. I don't think that's how contracts are written. Like they're not writing multi-year deals as of right now.
No, so, I think you'd have to. I think it would just
right. But if you're an advisor of those players, you'd be like, I mean, you could agree to that and back out at any time, so it really doesn't matter. Sure. And if anybody's advising them to sort of sort of believe that, you're a bad attorney because like it's not written anything and they'll just, they could change their mind anytime. So I don't think that that's really possible because you can't write that into any like if the contracts change and you're writing multi-year deals and look, you have escalators in each year of the contract, then sure, I think that I think that changes the market completely, right? Because you can then bank on a guy being a bench player, but then having a more sizable role in year 2 and 3, and the money plan, goes up accordingly. That's not the case right now, and that won't be the case for the immediate future. So I don't think that that's possible. And the transfer numbers have been like this the last 3 years. I think the thing that changed this year was the scramble for high-end paydays because people thought people would be desperate, to cash, to use that money before they went to the clearinghouse. And so guys went in, and maybe there was some more high-end guys or guys that thought they were high-end that could cash in. So maybe that changes a little bit of like the makeup of the portal, but I don't think, look, you see all these guys that are coming up from lower levels are still going to enter. And then, coaches are going to see a guy and want to replace him with somebody they think might be better. I just don't think the movement slows down all that much with the changes, unless you say you go to enforceable contracts, essentially become employees where you can, write those language in. But I think the era we're heading in towards makes it a little more transparent. And maybe that stops a little bit because guys can't, bluff their way into bigger deals or maybe don't have as much leverage. But I still think you're going to see the back end of rosters for, high major teams or power 4 teams change over every year as the top players for mid majors seek to move up. I think there's still going to be that just like,
the thing is that I think all of this, because the natural next step in if we start handing out multi-year contracts is contract buyouts.
Right.
And so I think all of this actually makes more sense if we do move just a couple steps further down the line.
Well, are you a fan of transfer fees, right? You're a soccer guy, right?
Well, yeah. So basically, it would be the same sort of thing. Let's say, let's use football. Football's a little bit of a cleaner example. Let's say there's a really promising quarterback in Dayton, and Ohio State's not sure. They offer him a scholarship, but they say, here's a scholarship and $100,000. And Toledo says, hey, listen, we'll offer you a scholarship and $250,000. We'll sign you to a 3-year deal with a $500,000 buyout. And we promise you will start basically right away. So we'll let you make some mistakes. We'll let you look like a freshman at times because we've built a, sort of a reputation of being like a great offensive team in the MAC. You'll get to throw the ball all over the place. We'll have good skilled players. We'll take care of you. And then in 2 years, when Ohio State looks at him, looks at that quarterback and says, yeah, he had it. He's proved it. Let's go get him. They have to pay the $500,000 buyout or $200,000 or whatever. That gets him out of his contract with Toledo. Ohio State can get him on a contract for, let's say, $2 million or whatever. I'm just making this up. And then some wealth gets redistributed back down the pyramid. That Ohio State has to send some money back to a place that needs it a lot more than Ohio State does. And this is how European soccer works. There are clubs in like Holland and in Portugal and in Italy and in Greece that are these sort of like, in Italy a little bit less so, but Holland and Portugal and Belgium are kind of 3 of the main ones that are very much secondary leagues competitively. And the best teams in those leagues, their whole business model is built around going and signing really, really promising young players, whether it's from, smaller leagues in Europe or it's from South America or Africa or wherever, developing those players and then selling them for really big fees to the clubs that have the most money in England and in Spain and in Germany and so forth. And it works for everyone. Those players tend to want to go to those clubs initially because those clubs will be financially invested in letting those players play young, make mistakes, and then move up. And then, it works for that club because that club gets the money to go, to operate, to go get the next 3 really promising young players and start the whole process again. And then from the player's perspective, Chelsea has a midfielder named Enzo Fernandez that went to a Portuguese club called Benfica for like 10 million euros and then got sold.
This is getting into the weeds, man.
No, but he got sold to Chelsea for like 120 million pounds. Well, that works for Enzo Fernandez too, because now Chelsea's put 120 million pounds into him. They're invested in him. Everyone knew who he was when he was a 10 million euro player coming out of Argentina.
And what are the American dollar terms in these figures?
I mean, I'm not going to pull up the currency conversion, but you understand my point. Is if Ohio State, if this hypothetical, quarterback from Dayton takes Ohio State's offer of $100,000 as a freshman and comes in, well, Ohio State's got no real skin in that game.
Right.
If he just doesn't hit immediately and they don't have room for him and they recruit over him, it's not a big deal. But if they go pay to buy out his contract and they offer him a $2 million a year deal, well, now Ohio State's invested. So it's worked for him too, is my point. It works for the athlete as well as the schools involved. Ohio State gets the assurance that this player is really good and that this player is ready to be Ohio State's starting quarterback. Toledo gets 2 years of a good player and then some financial compensation on the back end to keep sort of its program healthy. And the player gets a bunch of experience early at Toledo, and then the assurance that Ohio State can't just kind of kick him to the curb because they've put so much money into him to get him from Toledo to Columbus. So, I mean, listen, we've gone way further down the rabbit hole than I think we meant to. But you don't have to go very far to see how a lot of this works.
And but I think we're probably 2 more years of chaos until we get to that point.
Yeah.
And so for in the short term for Indiana basketball, I just think that it's going to be a rebuild next year. And then you asked me what stood out, that the juxtaposition between what Mike Woodson's approach was to obviously, he landed sort of top Power 4 guys that were available, and the only Power 4, player with Power 4 experience that Darian DeVries landed was his son Tucker. And when you kind of look at sort of the top 10, they're sort of like of teams ranked in the transfer rankings, team transfer rankings. They're a bit of an outlier in terms of other than Iowa, which signed 8 players, but most of them were from Drake, which made sense because they were carrying over. Just, how heavily he's relying on sort of, I know it's been compared to Signetti model, but just, I don't know if it's that or just players he likes that are more, you don't want to get into protracted recruiting battles because you are in a time crunch to try to rebuild the roster, but just a much different approach than Mike Woodson went in terms of talent, acquisition, what their makeup is, I guess I would say.
No, I mean, I like, and our good friend Matt Glennesk, whether he's listening or not, has kind of pitched me on pointing out there is kind of a Signetti-esque element to this. The one thing I would be cautious about is Kurt Signetti didn't invent the idea of up transfers. I mean,
well, but it also his was tied to the fact that he came from James Madison, so you bring the guys where you're from, right?
Sure.
If he was from,
and it's also different too in football, where talent or potential does not translate nearly as cleanly into production in football. There are a lot more, let's say, top 500 football recruits that wind up not developing. If you're a top 50 basketball player, there's a certain amount of assurance that you've got a floor in college basketball, and certainly if you're top 20. Whereas in football, there are plenty of guys that are highly rated that, because of the physical demands of the sport or whatever, just never develop into what we think they're going to be. But at the same time, Florida's 2 most important, sort of transfers, and maybe arguably its 2 single most important pieces last season, period, came from FIU and Iona. Kentucky affected its rebuild around guys from BYU and San Diego State. I think Dayton, Kobe Bryant came from Dayton. If you look at Auburn, I think people forget because he was there for so long that Janai Broome started at a mid-major. So did Chad Baker-Mazara. If you want to see San Diego State as a mid-major, maybe kind of a mid-major plus. My point is, it is natural. I mean, Amari Williams, Indiana just took a player from Drexel. Amari Williams was so important for Kentucky coming from Drexel last year. My point is more it's kind of natural in basketball that the heavy hitting high major programs are going to look to up transfers from mid major teams as one of their primary talent pools. Now, I think what's more relevant is your point, which is that for whatever reason, Mike Woodson tended not to. If you look at the transfers Mike Woodson took, Xavier Johnson from Pitt, Miller Kopp from Northwestern, at least the impact transfers, Kalel Ware from Oregon. Yes, you had a Peyton Sparks from Ball State, but you also had an Anthony Walker from Miami. You talk about last year, Washington State, Stanford, Arizona, Illinois. If anything, Indiana was arguably a bit more of an outlier then under Mike Woodson in terms of its seeming focus heavily on players transferring from other high major institutions.
It seems most teams there's a middle ground, right? You get a handful, you get a couple guys from Power 4 programs. If you're in the Big Ten or in the SEC, you kind of get a couple of those guys, and then you kind of fill out your holes, your needs.
I think what you find, if you look at like the and it's easy to kind of cherry pick like the schools that went deep into the tournament this year, but I think what you find is in a lot of those places, the players, the quote unquote high major players that are filling out the roster are players that you signed out of high school and developed. Like again, if you want to go back to Florida, for example, who were Florida's most important players other than Walter Clayton and Elijah Martin? Well, Alex Condon started at Florida. Will Richard, Florida. Thomas, is it Houck? I think it's Houck. It started at Florida. Again, like Houston was kind of held up as the paradigm, but like maybe not entirely unfairly. Of course, at Tennessee, you had somebody like Zakai Ziegler, but you also had, you had a bit of a mix there of Chaz Lanier came in from, I think, South Florida. Felix Okpara was a high major transfer from Ohio State. My point is, I think as often as not, when you're looking at the rosters that people sort of view as success stories in sort of the modern roster construction, a lot of the time the players you're talking about that are like the sort of high major talents that wind up filling bigger roles for you don't transfer in. They're developed within your program. Or maybe it is a situation like a Janai Broom where he starts in a mid-major, but he was at Auburn for 3 seasons. So he develops steadily over the course of a high major career as well. And that's where I think you kind of look at it and say, like, there's just an element of this that can only come with time. And I don't think in this modern era you need to take freshmen you're not sure about anymore. Like, you need to take guys that are reaches, and yes, you can just kind of run them off. I get that. Like, yes, you can just sort of say, sorry, but there's nothing for you here anymore if they don't work out. But on the other hand, you also just, why not just fill that spot with a steady transfer for 1 year while you spend a year vetting a bunch of high school players and going out and finding guys that maybe the next season that roster spot goes to a high school player that you develop. Because that's what DeVries has kind of talked about. He has said he wants rosters that are sort of balanced between, players developed within the program over a period of years, and then astute transfer portal additions. Well, you can only have the first of those with time. You can't have a player for 3 years in one summer. So that's the part of it that a little bit like, where you might see some comparison to Kurt Cignetti's. I think Kurt Cignetti would like to get there eventually too, where his roster is a little bit more balanced and he's becoming less portal reliant every single cycle. But that just takes time.
And then the other takeaway, if the 3-point shooting, I added up the numbers between what basically their top 5 3-point shooters: Drake, Conaway, Miles, Wilkerson, and DeVries, based on his yearly average, because obviously he was hurt last year. So Indiana hit 203 threes last year. How many do you think that group that group would be sort of projected at or hit kind of combined last year?
It had to be over 250.
344.
Yeah, I was going to say over 300, and I was worried that was a little too bullish, but I think if you look it
Is
up,
that number? But I mean, that's your number, right? That was your dream.
well, no, I
See a 3-point shooting team finally in your.
I would throw back another way, which is to your point about that number. They're all volume shooters. Like I don't even, when I start talking about 3-point shooting in this roster construction, I cut Reed Bailey off because he shot like 41% or 40%.
He was not included. I just included
but he was only on like 41 attempts. I'm talking about guys that shoot at volume. Every single one of those guys' career average, and throw Luke Goody in there as well. Every single one of those guys' career average is over 36%. So, and a couple of them have, kind of done this where, maybe they, I think Enright was really good in his last year at Drake and then not as good this year at DePaul. But my point is, from a career perspective, you are talking about above average 3-point shooters or better. And that's what
Conaway is an exception to that too. He's shot under 30% for his career, just to point out.
Yeah, I didn't include Conaway. I mean, he was a volume shooter, but I'm talking DeVries, Enright, Wilkerson, Drake, and if you want to include him, Goody. That's 5 guys that have all shot 36% or better for their careers. Most of them have had a year where they've been more like 38, 39. Wilkerson shot over 40% last season on high volume at Sam Houston State. And then the other thing, too, that you throw in there is Conaway and Drake are very good creative guards. And guys like Wilkerson and DeVries aren't necessarily pass first players, but they have been in systems that required them to be creative for others as well as taking and making their own shots. So you've got some secondary ball handling and creativity in there as well. You have, at least on paper, and Conaway was arguably one of the most creative guards in the country last year. So he doesn't shoot it as well, but he's by all accounts exceptional defensively. And he had, I think, a top 20 assist rate nationally a season ago. You have not just the shooting piece of it, but also the creativity and the passing piece of it. And I've said a lot that in when I've been asked or when I've gotten into these discussions about what DeVries' roster looks like, that it's a dangerously lazy comparison. But every time I've heard him talk about offense, every time I've watched clips of his offense, every time I've looked at some of these players that Indiana's adding, I have thought about Greg McDermott's Creighton. And obviously, if you're Indiana, maybe you're hopeful that your resources and your prestige and the Big Ten and everything allows you over time to get a slightly even higher caliber of athlete than what Creighton gets, although that's probably a bit disrespectful to what Creighton's had in the last few years. Creighton's had some really, really good players. But that's what I feel like I see is just a lot of court spacing, a lot of ball movement, and, yes, the ability to make threes at a level that Indiana has just not had, even if you think about last year, where I think we expected Indiana to be a better 3-point shooting team, and it wasn't. Even then, you still sort of said, well, this is going to come down to 2 or 3 guys. This is basically going to be like Goody, Mbako, and maybe somebody like Trey Galloway or Kanan Carlisle. And then Indiana just needs everybody else to get a little bit better. Miles Rice to go up to 34%, and Malik Renew to add a little volume, and Anthony Leal to add a little volume. You don't have any volume concern here. You don't have any creativity concern here. And historically speaking, you don't have any concerns with shooting accuracy with this group. And I think that's why Indiana fans, I think, are justifiably excited about the way these sort of backcourt guard wing rotation is shaped up.
Have they hit 300? I'm going back. Have they hit 300 3-pointers in a season since you've covered the team?
I mean, I can think of the years when that would have been most likely, and I'm just going to need a minute to.
I mean, I'm going back. If you could tell me the year. I mean, so far I'm at 27, 18, and the answer is no.
I would the years that it would be likely would
they were 5 short in 16, 17.
I was the years that would be likely would be 12, 13, 15, and 16.
16 and 17, 295.
I would be shocked if at least one of Tom Crean's.
Yeah, the Yogi Ferrell's last year, they had 345.
Yeah, and I bet they hit as many or more the year before that because they were incredibly 3-point reliant that year. I mean, to the point
less, twice during your time covering. So about 10 years, though, since then.
Okay. And obviously, listen, these numbers are going to adjust down a little bit. Like, there's always an extent to which players are getting extra volume at the mid-major level simply because there's less individual talent, and so.
But based on the
when you have
prevalence of 3-point shooters, 300 seems not unreasonable.
No, I took well, and like I said, this is where I would say not just shooters, but creators as well. Like, I don't think Indiana is going to have any trouble. Connor Enright has a really good reputation both as a point guard and as a shooter. Not necessarily maybe at the same volume, particularly scoring the ball as some of these other guys, but that's another player that can both create shots for others and make his own when somebody creates them for him. It's felt in recent years like Indiana had, approaching enough of one, like Trey Galloway or Trace Jackson Davis, it had at least one or two, Jalen Huchefino, Xavier Johnson, at least one or two players that were consistently sort of creating the opportunities Indiana needed, but obviously nobody hitting at nearly the level necessary in terms of volume or accuracy. And I just don't think those will be concerns here. There is still kind of like a clear and present need. I think it's fair to say, which is front court. And I think that's been at least a little bit by design, in the sense that I think Indiana has kind of gone elsewhere for a lot of its volume. If you look at, I do have the numbers right in front of me. I did these numbers after Tatum Conaway committed, so this doesn't include Drake. But if you look at Reed Bailey, Tatum Conaway, Lamar Wilkerson, and Tucker DeVries, last season they averaged 68.4 points, 19.6 rebounds, 13.5 assists, and 6.2 steals combined. So listen, again, those numbers will change a little bit when they come up to the Big Ten level. But my point is all of those players are high volume players. What Indiana is looking for in the front court is not somebody that's taken 12 shots a game. And even more than that, I think I heard or read somewhere that West Virginia was in like the bottom 10 percentile last year for percentage of post-ups. This is not an offense that bases itself around sending a big to the post, dumping the ball down there, and letting the offense operate around him. It's much more one that I think needs a more narrowly defined sort of set of skills from its big. And I think that's defensively and offensively be really good around the glass and around the rim. Contest and block shots, clear the boards, be good in the ball screen game. If you can pop a little bit, that's great, but not going to need a ton of volume from you there. But you're always a lob threat. You're always a threat to finish well around the rim, to clean up offensive rebounds, those kinds of things. And so when you look at like the averages and you look at the usage rates and you look at like some of the players Indiana seems to be targeting, like Federico from Texas Tech, you're not surprised that these are players that don't have a lot of volume in their careers from a scoring perspective in particular, because it just doesn't feel like Indiana needs that. Indiana maybe needs something a little bit more narrowly defined, but it does need those bodies because it's only got one player on roster right now for next season that is an out-and-out forward. And even Reed Bailey, if you look at his profile, he's not an incredibly prolific shot blocker or rebounder. Indiana's got to have somebody who I think is a real rim presence at both ends of the floor.
Well, is it Miles a forward, but he's not obviously a rim protector.
No, he's a wing. He's very good rebounding the ball, but he's 6'6".
Yeah, but you just said forward. I just you're talking about more about bigger post presence type of.
I think Miles would be more of like a wing. I think I'm talking Bailey is a forward. He's 6'10". He's very clearly a big, but he's a more modern four, a little bit more of probably what Indiana hoped Malik Renew could be, and he never really became, if that makes sense.
What's your impression though of the overall talent level that they've assembled? I mean, I know there's pieces to be brought in, and like you said, they'll need a post presence. But just in terms of what they've landed, I mean, obviously, I think Wilkerson is sort of, maybe the gem of the class so far, obviously outside of Tucker. But what is your overall impression of sort of the talent level of the group they've assembled? Because to me, it feels like system matters more than the players, and maybe Tucker sort of as a cheat code to that because you have him in your back pocket as a guy that can play at this level and is talented. But fit, obviously, we've talked about, he said, is the most important thing to him. And so I don't know, I'm just curious as to what you think about it.
No, I mean, listen, you're always going to have to answer the question just with production, like whether or not mid-major guys can step up to the high major level. And we talked earlier about the fact that taking high major guys is not always a guarantee of success. I think with the last 2 years my main takeaway, at least from the last 2 years of watching kind of the portal era, is the coach matters a lot more than the players. And that I can watch Miles Rice and totally understand and agree with why Miles Rice was such a highly rated transfer. I can watch Miles Rice play and say, yes, he was one of the best. I get it. In purely individual terms, he was one of the best point guards in the country in last year's portal class. He has tons of potential. I wouldn't be shocked if he thrives for Buzz Williams at Maryland. But what we also learn is that Miles Rice talent only goes so far if his coach doesn't know what to do with him, and if his coach doesn't, does not figure out the best way to sort of plug into that talent and make it, sort of sync up or make it compatible to what the coach is trying to do offensively and defensively. And that's where you just don't know. DeVries has had success with transfers at times before. Those Drake teams were a little bit more of a mix. Obviously, last year at West Virginia, a lot of transfers. Javon Small had a really good season. Tucker DeVries seemed like he was having a good season before he got injured. Amani Hansberry had a good season. He came over from, I think, Illinois as well. Sincere Harris also came over from Illinois and was good. But that's just 1 year. That's 1 year, and it's a year where like the plan gets blown up pretty early on because Tucker DeVries gets hurt. So you don't want to treat that like sort of gospel. I think on paper it looks like a good team. On paper, last year's team did too. And, from a different direction on paper. And even in some of those early season games, I think we both in different ways came away from that Tennessee exhibition like, okay, maybe this team's got a little something. Maybe there's kind of some juice to really dig into here. And then it just very quickly turned out that there wasn't. I think you have to have a certain amount of faith in the coach because, like I said, my lesson observing the last 2 years when the portal era has really kind of settled in is that what matters a lot more is the coach being able to identify within individual players the traits he needs and then put them in positions to succeed. I think a lot of this makes sense to me, Indiana needs two bigs. And I think they both can be of generally the same archetype that I just talked about. Defend the rim, clear the glass, lobs, dunks, good in the screen game. Everything else is a bonus. Probably not going to post you up very much at all. Everything else is a bonus. I think it needs two of those just because you need depth. You don't want to wind up in a situation where one gets hurt and you have nothing behind him. And then after that, depending on the outcome of Luke Goody's waiver case, you'll have 2 to 3 spots to play with, and you can do with that what you want in terms of depth. Maybe there are a couple high school freshmen you want to get on late. Maybe there's a young player in the portal that you think needs a little bit more seasoning and development, but could have a higher ceiling long term, so you bring them in. But like, as if you promised me right now Indiana would get 2 bigs that can fulfill all the functions I just talked about and don't have to do anything more than that. They can average like 6 and 6 or 6 and 7. That's fine. As long as for what Indiana needs, they are consistent.
You're telling me you're going to get 2 more big guys that are going to average 6 and 7 per game?
Well, I think probably one that's more your starter that's 6 and 7, and another one that's maybe projectable. Because again, there have been some links to, I think Leo Curtis is his name. I think he's from Iceland. He was committed to, I'll find it right now. I've completely forgotten. He was actually recruited by both West Virginia and Indiana. I think he was with Arizona State and he got out of that, so he's open again. There's been a lot of question given the fact that he has a previous history with IU and also with this staff. Would he be somebody that Indiana would pursue, a 7-foot center? I think he's from Iceland, but he's been playing prep ball here in the States, so it's not like, the American sort of standard of basketball would be a shock to him. A guy like that would be interesting to me more as a long-term piece, whereas someone like the Texas Tech, Federico, the Texas Tech center transfer from Finland, that would be someone who it's more like steps in essentially right away. And just like that's your starter at the 5. And I mean, last year he averaged 5.1 points and 4.5 rebounds. I think you'd want those numbers to come up a little bit, but I think he'd also play more.
So you don't think Bailey would start at the 5?
I think if you got someone like that, no. Because Bailey
but don't you think that could be maybe the plan?
If that's the plan, I think this team's going to have some real defensive deficiencies. I mean, I like Bailey is a really intriguing player. He's very efficient for what he is. I'm curious if he can add any. He shot 41.5% on 41 3-point attempts last season. He's an incredibly talented or incredibly consistent free throw shooter, which you don't see very often for a big. And he's a great passer. And if you watch his film, he's really good in like ball screen situations and out in the open floor. His footwork, his vision. He is not a prolific rebounder, and he is not a prolific shot blocker. And he really never has been. And that's down at the A10 level. I don't expect those qualities to become more pronounced at the high major level than they were at the mid major level. I mean, if that is the plan, then, fair enough, but you're probably going to wind up in a situation where you are probably going to wind up in a situation where you are just kind of trying to outscore some teams. Like, to give you a comparison, for comparison's sake, last year at Davidson, Reed Bailey, his defensive rebounding percentage was 16.2, or his defensive rebound rate. His block rate was 2.5. Amani Hansberry, who was essentially West Virginia's starting center, who was smaller but probably a little bit more muscular, had a lower block rate at 1.9, but a considerably higher defensive rebound rate that was actually better in conference play. And in my experience...
But when you look at the West Virginia's predominant starting lineups, they had a bigger guy, Eduardo Andre, and who started... I don't know if he got hurt or they just moved away from him.
Hansberry played a lot more than he did.
Yeah, but I'm saying, so he started 9 games, but he was healthy, and then they went away from it and went to Hansberry. It seems to me that they preferred a lineup that just had one sort of forward, not necessarily a big.
I mean, if you want to use Andre as an example, then in the 31 games he played at West Virginia last year, he only attempted 96 twos or 96 field goals total, but his block rate was 9.6%. That's elite. That's incredible.
But what I'm saying is they didn't have him.
Rate was significantly better too.
Right, but I'm saying they didn't have him start.
Yeah, I understand that, but Hansberry was a substantially better rebounder than Bailey on a percentage basis.
Okay.
And Andre was both a better rebounder and a better shot blocker, a substantially better shot blocker on a percentage basis. Neither one of them were particularly. Hansberry was a little bit more high usage offensively. I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that they just kind of wound up in a 2-man game with Hansberry and Javon Small because Tucker DeVries got hurt and then other guys had to fill in around him. But both of those guys had significantly better defensive numbers at the Big 12 level than Reed Bailey had at the A10 level. I don't think, and I don't know this, but looking, and if you want to go back through Darian DeVries' Drake teams, he had players like that in Drake too. I think Darnell Brody was very much that way, where he got a lot of his usage grew offensively as time went on, but what he always guaranteed to be was a good rim protector and a great rebounder. I just think looking at his teams at Drake, looking at his one West Virginia team, looking at this team as currently constructed, I don't think Reed Bailey's what he wants at the 5. I think Bailey is what he wants at the 4, or at least, could develop into what he wants at the 4. And I think Bailey can spend some time at the 5 if necessary with Tucker DeVries at the 4, because DeVries played a lot of 4 at Drake. It seemed like was trending more toward being a tweener of a 3-4 at West Virginia before he got hurt. You don't know how much of that is preference and how much of that is just the level and the fact that, like, at Drake, maybe you're playing a little smaller because your talent, that's where your talent is. Whereas if you're at a high major level, maybe Tucker DeVries is more of a 3. I don't know. We'll see. But for my money, Bailey profiles more like a 4. And that means you're looking for somebody from a defensive perspective in particular to play the 5. And then I think you have, my point is, you take one of those players, he and Bailey kind of can interchange at the 5 depending on needs, depending on matchups, and then you have another one to back up that big and also develop longer.
That's just a lot of talent to add at this point when you've already sort of, I mean, I don't know.
If Goody gets his waiver, they still have 3 scholarships remaining. 4
No, it's not that. Yeah, but I mean, generally, when you have the 2 scholarships remaining, you're not looking for 2 guys that can contribute 25 minutes per game and be.
They have 4 scholarships remaining.
I'm saying your last 2, whatever, your bottom 3 couple players, to get multiple guys at that point when you've built out this much of the roster, I just think would be surprising.
I think you're looking for one player that is a consistent rotation piece at the 5. And then I think, let's live in a world where Luke Goody gets his 5th year. That's 9 scholarship players. Then Indiana signs a 5 who plays, let's say, 25 plus minutes a game, whether they start, whether they come off the bench, whatever, 25 or more minutes, or maybe 23 or more minutes a game next season. That takes you to 10 scholarship players. That still gives you 3 spots to play with. Now, I wouldn't be shocked if Indiana doesn't go all the way to 13. That wouldn't stun me. I think a lot of coaches don't do that. But even if Goody gets a 5th year, even if you take a player like what I'm talking about, you still have 2 to 3 spots to play with. So you can fill one of those with a project, you can fill one of those with a young big, and that's the bottom end of your roster. And those are guys that you develop longer term so that in 2 years, under ideal conditions, you're not replacing everybody. You get back to more of that roster balance that we were talking about earlier.
Gotcha.
There we go. Any other business? We've gone almost an hour. I think we've done enough for today.
Well, I had 2 people ask questions. Mark asked, "Do I believe in John Hendry? I think it's Joe Hendry, isn't it? I don't get his shtick. He's a wrestler. I don't know if you know who he is, Zach.
I don't know who he is now.
I have a buddy that really likes him. I don't get him as much. And then somebody asked the contra code, which was up, up, down, down, left, right, BA start. Did you know that as well? Did you know what contra was?
No, I didn't know what the contra. I don't know what any of that is.
Terrible.
I'm sorry.
Terrible.
I apologize. Humbly apologize.
You should.
Yeah. Well, I have nothing to throw back in your direction. Do you know where to find all 8 purple stakes in Pokemon Scarlet? Because I do now. Because Jackson was homesick yesterday, and he
homesick again. It's not even. It's now. It's April. It's like, get it, you guys.
I know, it's frustrating. He's back at school today. He had a low fever and a real bad cough, but he's good now. But yesterday he demanded that I Google it and help him find all 8 stakes.
So before we go, who's winning the little 500?
I told you. I'm not into predictions.
Women's race, because you're not involved in the women's race.
I'm focused one lap at a time. We're on to 2025. Every lap has a life of its own. I don't think I'll even go to the women's race, unfortunately, this year, just because bus drop off is at 4:30. So it's literally, I'd have to be at the track when I have to be home to get Jackson off the bus. But it'll be a fun weekend. It always is. He'll be there in an official capacity. I'll be there in a coaching capacity. Little 500 women's race Friday at 4, men's race Saturday at 2. Turn out for one or both if you can. It is always a good time. He is Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. This has been Mind Your Banners for April 22nd, 2025. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you soon.